The afternoon of June 15, 1944, Chengdu, China. Major General Curtis LeMay watched as 47 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses disappeared into the hazy sky, bound for Yawata on the Japanese home island of Kyushu. Each aircraft carried approximately 6,000 pounds of bombs in their cavernous dual bomb bays. Japanese intelligence officers had studied reconnaissance photographs and captured documents for months, attempting to understand American bomber capabilities. What they learned from technical specifications suggested the B-29 represented a quantum leap in strategic bombing technology. What they failed to comprehend was the full implications of those numbers. The specifications were clear enough. Maximum internal bomb capacity, 20,000 pounds. Service ceiling exceeding 31,000 feet. Cruising speed of 220 miles per hour. Range extending beyond 3,000 miles with partial bomb loads. Japanese military planners possessed these figures. They had analyzed captured B-17 flying fortresses and extrapolated American industrial capabilities. Yet numbers on paper rarely conveyed operational reality. The true shock would come not from what the B-29 could theoretically accomplish, but from what American industrial might would actually deliver over Japanese cities. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The B-29 Superfortress emerged from a specification written in January 1940 by the United States Army Air Corps. The requirement demanded an aircraft capable of carrying a ton of bombs for every 1,000 miles flown, maintaining speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled to operate. Boeing's engineers responded with an aircraft that pushed every boundary of contemporary aviation technology. 4 Wright R-3000, 350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower at takeoff. Twin General Electric turbo superchargers per engine, maintaining sea-level power at altitudes approaching 33,000 feet. Fully pressurized crew compartments allowing normal breathing while flying higher than Mount Everest's base elevation. The prototype XB-29 first flew on September 21, 1942. By the time production aircraft reached operational units in early 1944, the B-29 program had consumed $3 billion, exceeding even the Manhattan Project's cost. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, staked his career on the Superfortress. His deputy, Lauris Norstad, later observed that Arnold's life became inseparable from the B-29 program. Failure was not acceptable. Japanese intelligence services monitored American bomber development throughout the early war years. Reports from agents in neutral countries, technical journals obtained through diplomatic channels, and interrogation of captured airmen provided fragmentary information. By mid-1943, Imperial General Headquarters possessed reasonably accurate specifications for the B-29. Intelligence officers understood this bomber differed fundamentally from the B-17 and B-24 aircraft already encountered in limited numbers in the Pacific. The B-17 Flying Fortress, backbone of American strategic bombing in Europe, carried maximum internal bomb loads of 4,000 pounds on long-range missions. The B-24 Liberator managed similar payloads. Both aircraft operated effectively at altitudes between 20 and 25,000 feet, within reach of Japanese interceptors and anti-aircraft weapons. Japanese planners anticipated the B-29 would represent an incremental improvement over these proven designs. The reality proved far more disturbing. The B-29's 2 bomb bays, arranged in tandem fore and aft to maintain the fuselage's narrow, streamlined profile, could accommodate ordnance configurations impossible in earlier bombers. Maximum capacity reached 20,000 pounds, 5 times the B-17's practical payload. But maximum capacity figures told only part of the story. The critical question Japanese planners failed to fully appreciate was what bomb loads the B-29 would actually deliver over targets in Japan, and from what altitudes. The physics of long-range strategic bombing required brutal compromises. Every pound of bombs meant 1 less pound of fuel. Every 1,000 feet of altitude gained consumed hundreds of gallons climbing through thin air. The 9,363 gallons of fuel carried in the B-29's wing tanks and bomb bay auxiliary tanks determined mission parameters. Flying from bases in China to targets in southern Japan, then returning, demanded careful calculation. On that first mission to Yawata on June 15, 1944, the B-29 seconds flew at altitudes between 8,000 and 21,000 feet, constrained by fuel requirements for the 1,500-mile round trip from Chinese bases. Even at these modest heights compared to the aircraft's capabilities, Japanese fighters struggled. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu twin-engine fighters that scrambled to intercept found their Nakajima Ha-25 engines, rated at 1,080 horsepower each, performing poorly above 20,000 feet. Engine power dropped to perhaps 60% of sea level output in thin air. Climbing consumed excessive fuel. Engines overheated dangerously. Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura managed to shoot down one B-29, the aircraft designated Limber Dragon, killing all 12 crew members. This lone victory cost Kimura nearly all his ammunition and pushed his engine to the edge of catastrophic failure. Around him, other pilots fired desperately at the silver bombers, achieving little. The B-29's defensive armament, 10 50-caliber machine guns controlled by sophisticated General Electric, computing sights, responded with devastating accuracy. Gunners coordinated fire through an integrated system, allowing multiple positions to engage single targets simultaneously. Japanese pilots accustomed to individual defensive guns on earlier American bombers found themselves facing interlocking fields of fire, calculated by analog computers. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the Imperial Army's 244th Sentai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter leaders, documented the frustration in his unit's after-action reports. American bombers operated at altitudes where Japanese fighters barely maintained level flight, let alone maneuvered for combat. The B-29's speed at altitude, approximately 350 miles per hour true airspeed, matched what Japanese interceptors could achieve above 25,000 feet while struggling for every knot. Even reaching bombing altitude cost fighters excessive fuel, leaving minimal time over target and engines running so hot that failure threatened constantly. The secret to American high-altitude superiority lay in technology Japan had examined but never successfully implemented at scale. Each B-29 engine mounted two General Electric B-series turbo superchargers that captured exhaust gases and used them to spin turbine wheels at speeds exceeding 20,000 revolutions per minute. These turbines drove centrifugal compressors that forced air into engine intake manifolds at sea level pressure, even at 30,000 feet altitude. The principle was elegant, but the execution demanded manufacturing precision Japan could not match. Turbo superchargers required metallurgy beyond Japanese industrial capabilities. Turbine wheels operated in exhaust temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, while centrifugal forces created stresses equivalent to thousands of pounds per square inch. Any metal imperfection caused catastrophic turbine failure, sending turbine fragments through engine cowlings and often igniting magnesium engine components. American manufacturers possessed metallurgical expertise, precision forging equipment, and quality control systems to produce reliable units. General Electric's Schenectady, New York plant manufactured thousands monthly to exacting specifications. Japanese industry attempted turbo supercharger production beginning in 1941 after engineers examined captured technical documents. Nakajima Aircraft Company devoted considerable resources to development, yet despite 3 years of effort, Japan never produced operational turbo supercharged fighters in meaningful numbers. The metallurgical challenges proved insurmountable. Turbine blades required machining to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. High-temperature alloys exceeded what Japanese furnaces consistently produced. Even bearings designed to operate in extreme heat while maintaining precise alignment represented manufacturing capabilities the empire did not possess. Lieutenant Fumio Niwa, an engineering officer who evaluated captured B-29 components later in the war, documented findings that survived in Japanese technical archives. Examining a turbo supercharger removed from a crashed B-29 China, Niwa expressed admiration for American manufacturing precision. Turbine blades were machined to tolerances far tighter than Japanese practice. The units were balanced so perfectly they spun at maximum speed without vibration that would indicate impending failure. Most importantly, the systematic nature of American production became evident. Every turbo supercharger met identical specifications. Components were genuinely interchangeable between aircraft, eliminating the skilled fitting work Japanese maintenance required. The June 15th mission to Yawata demonstrated another reality Japanese planners had underestimated. Of 68 B-29 seconds that departed Chinese bases, only 47 reached the target, not because of enemy action, but because of the operational complexity of deploying such sophisticated aircraft across vast distances. 5 bombers crashed during landing or ditched in the Bay of Bengal. 42 others landed at bases they were not assigned to, running dangerously low on fuel. The mission was technically a failure from a bombing perspective. Only one bomb struck the target factory complex at Yawata. Yet from Japanese perspective, the appearance of B-29 seconds over the home islands for the first time since Jimmy Doolittle's carrier-launched raid in April 1942 sent shockwaves through military and political leadership. American strategic bombing had reached Japan. The distances that protected the home islands no longer provided security, and if B-29 seconds could reach southern Kyushu from bases in China, what would happen when Americans captured islands closer to Japan? Imperial General Headquarters began receiving disturbing intelligence throughout late 1944. American forces had seized Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Mariana Islands chain. Reconnaissance flights revealed massive construction activity, runways being lengthened and strengthened, dispersal areas expanded, fuel storage facilities under construction on a scale that dwarfed any Japanese military airfield. The implications were unmistakable. The Marianas, located only 1,500 miles from Tokyo, would become B-29 bases far more capable than the improvised fields in China. Japanese intelligence officers calculated probable bomb loads for B-29 missions from the Marianas. The shorter distance compared to operations from China meant aircraft could carry more bombs and less fuel. Estimates suggested bomb loads approaching 10,000 to 12,000 pounds per aircraft might be achievable. If American forces could deploy 300 to 400 B-29 seconds to the Marianas, as construction activity suggested, each mission could deliver 3 to 4 million pounds of explosives on Japanese cities. This represented destructive capacity far exceeding anything previously experienced. What Japanese planners failed to fully appreciate was American willingness to accept trade-offs that maximized destruction. The B-29 had been designed as a high-altitude precision bomber, attacking specific industrial targets from altitudes above 30,000 feet, where defenses could not reach effectively. But American commanders possessed flexibility Japanese military culture rarely permitted. If high-altitude precision bombing proved less effective than desired, alternatives existed. On November 24, 1944, 111 B-29 seconds departed Saipan for Tokyo in the first mission designated San Antonio 1. The strike targeted the Musashino aircraft factory on Tokyo's outskirts. Weather over target was poor. High winds scattered formations. Only 24 aircraft bombed the primary target, though others struck surrounding areas. Japanese air defenses, reinforced since June, mounted determined resistance. Fighters engaged throughout the mission. Anti-aircraft fire proved more intense than anticipated. 1 B-29 was lost. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Tokyo residents, who had experienced only Doolittle's brief raid more than 2 years earlier, now watched wave after wave of huge silver bombers crossing overhead at altitudes Japanese fighters struggled to reach. Air raid sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns fired continuously. The thundering sound of hundreds of Wright R-3350 engines reverberated across the city. Even though bombing accuracy disappointed American commanders, Japanese civilians understood the era of immunity from air attack had ended permanently. Over subsequent weeks, additional missions struck targets across Japan. The B-29 seconds typically operated at altitudes between 25 and 30,000 feet, well above effective Japanese fighter interception. Losses to enemy action averaged less than 1% of sorties, remarkably low compared to the bomber operations over Germany, where Luftwaffe fighters and flak batteries extracted terrible casualties. But high-altitude bombing proved frustratingly inaccurate over Japan. Meteorologists had not yet discovered the jet stream, powerful high-altitude winds that could exceed 200 miles per hour. These winds scattered bomb formations, pushed munitions miles off target, and made precision aiming nearly impossible. Crews found themselves flying against or with atmospheric currents that affected ground speed by over 100 miles per hour. Navigation became problematic. Fuel consumption calculations proved unreliable. The bomber stream that looked precise in formation often delivered bombs scattered across vast areas rather than concentrated on specific targets. American commanders faced a choice: continue ineffective high-altitude precision attacks or adopt new tactics that sacrificed altitude for accuracy and increased bomb loads. The theoretical maximum of 20,000 pounds bomb capacity meant little if aircraft could only carry 7,000 to 8,000 pounds on high-altitude long-range missions from the Marianas. But if bombers descended to lower altitudes, they could carry substantially more ordnance. They could also navigate more accurately and bomb more precisely using radar systems that functioned better below heavy weather. The trade-off was vulnerability. Lower altitudes brought B-29 seconds within reach of anti-aircraft guns and Japanese fighters. Defensive armament would become critical rather than merely precautionary. Casualties would increase. Yet, if increased accuracy and heavier bomb loads produced proportionally greater damage, the exchange might prove acceptable. Japanese planners, studying American operational patterns through late 1944 and early 1945, remained convinced the B-29 would continue high-altitude operations. Japanese fighter and anti-aircraft doctrine emphasized reaching high-altitude bombers. Resources flowed to developing tactics and weapons for engagement above 25,000 feet. What Japanese intelligence failed to anticipate was the most devastating decision American commanders would make. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XXI Bomber Command in the Marianas. LeMay had commanded B-29 operations from India and China, experiencing firsthand the frustrations of high-altitude precision bombing. He understood the B-29's technical capabilities intimately. More importantly, he possessed willingness to discard doctrinal orthodoxy when results demanded different approaches. LeMay examined intelligence reports on Japanese cities. Most urban areas contained extensive wooden construction. Industrial production was increasingly dispersed into residential areas as major factories were destroyed or threatened. Workers produced components in small workshops integrated into neighborhoods. Destroying these cottage industries required different weapons than precision high-explosive bombs. It required fire. The concept of incendiary bombing was not new. The Royal Air Force had devastated German cities using area bombing tactics with incendiary munitions. American forces had conducted experimental fire raids against Japanese targets, with mixed results. But LeMay contemplated an approach more radical than previous attempts. He would strip B-29 seconds of most defensive armament, reducing weight to allow maximum bomb loads. Missions would fly at night when Japanese fighters operating without effective radar struggled to locate targets. Aircraft would attack from altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, low enough for bombardiers to aim precisely using visual and radar methods, yet high enough to avoid most light anti-aircraft fire. Most controversial of all, the bomb loads would consist almost entirely of incendiary weapons. M69 incendiary clusters, each containing dozens of bomblets filled with jellied gasoline napalm. When these weapons ignited across wooden neighborhoods, individual fires would merge into conflagrations that consumed entire districts. The destruction would be total, but so would civilian casualties. LeMay understood the moral implications. He proceeded anyway, convinced that devastating fire attacks offered the surest path to ending the war without American invasion of Japan. Japanese intelligence detected subtle changes in B-29 operations through February 1945. Some aircraft appeared to be flying without full defensive armament. Mission profiles occasionally included lower altitude approaches. Incendiary weapons appeared more frequently in bomb loads, but these variations seemed experimental rather than doctrinal shifts. Japanese defensive planning continued emphasizing high-altitude interception. The firestorm that consumed Tokyo on March 10, 1945, revealed capabilities Japanese military planners had catastrophically underestimated. Not the B-29's technical specifications, which intelligence had documented reasonably well, but the operational flexibility and industrial capacity those specifications enabled. The aircraft's 20,000-pound maximum bomb capacity had seemed like a theoretical figure, achievable only under ideal conditions on short missions. That night, stripped of defensive guns and flying at low altitude where fuel consumption decreased dramatically, B-29 seconds delivered bomb loads approaching their absolute maximum capacity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 279 aircraft, each carrying approximately 14,000 pounds of incendiaries. Total ordnance delivered exceeded 1,665 tons. Across 16 square miles of Tokyo, M69 clusters burst open at 2,000 feet altitude, scattering bomblets that ignited upon impact. Each bomblet contained jellied gasoline, designed to burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The weapons were specifically engineered to penetrate wooden roofs before igniting, ensuring fires started inside structures rather than on exterior surfaces where they might be more easily extinguished. The conflagration developed with terrifying speed. Individual fires merged within minutes, creating a firestorm that generated its own weather system. Superheated air rose rapidly, pulling in surrounding atmosphere to replace it. Wind speeds at ground level reached 70 miles per hour, fanning flames and spreading combustion faster than people could flee. The temperature in the fire zone exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and vaporize human bodies. Rivers offered no refuge. Water temperatures rose until people who jumped in to escape flames were boiled alive. Japanese authorities later estimated 83,000 dead, though the true number probably exceeded 100,000. 40,000 more suffered burns and injuries. Over 1 million people lost their homes. Police records indicated 267,000 buildings destroyed, approximately 1/4 of Tokyo's structures. The industrial impact was immediate and devastating. Command intelligence officers deleted 22 numbered priority industrial targets from attack lists because they no longer existed. 18% of Tokyo's industrial area and 63% of the commercial district had been incinerated. For Japanese military and civilian leadership, the Tokyo firestorm forced recognition of a capability they had not imagined possible. American B-29 seconds could deliver destructive force equivalent to earthquakes or typhoons, natural disasters beyond human defense. The realization that this attack represented not an exceptional effort but a repeatable tactic proved even more disturbing. If Americans could mount such a raid against Tokyo, they could replicate it against Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and every other major city. Japan possessed no effective defense. The night raid tactics eliminated Japanese fighter advantages. Pilots trained for daylight interception struggled to locate bombers in darkness. Japan had developed airborne radar, but equipment was crude and rarely available. Ground-controlled interception techniques were primitive compared to German or British systems. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns fired blindly at engine sounds overhead. When fighters did manage to close on B-29 seconds, the American bombers' speed at low altitude made engagement difficult. A B-29, at 8,000 feet flying at 280 miles per hour, could maintain that speed indefinitely with minimal fuel consumption. Japanese fighters pushing maximum performance to catch bombers burned fuel at unsustainable rates, leaving minutes over target before reserves demanded return to base. The anti-aircraft defenses concentrated around Tokyo proved inadequate against low-altitude night attacks. Heavy anti-aircraft guns positioned for high-altitude targets could not depress sufficiently to engage bombers at 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Medium anti-aircraft weapons lacked the sophisticated fire control systems necessary for night engagements. Searchlight batteries struggled to acquire and hold targets in smoke-filled skies. The few B-29 seconds damaged by ground fire usually reached safety. Losses remained under 3%, acceptable by any measure. Over subsequent nights and weeks, the firebombing campaign expanded. Nagoya on March 11th, Osaka on March 13th, Kobe on March 16th. Each raid followed the Tokyo pattern. Low-altitude night attacks delivering maximum incendiary loads against urban areas. Japanese defenses proved consistently ineffective. Cities burned, industrial production collapsed, civilian morale disintegrated. The psychological impact of watching cities destroyed from the air without effective response shattered Japanese confidence in military protection. Lieutenant Colonel Shigeharu Asayeda, an operations officer at Imperial General Headquarters, wrote in classified reports that March that Japan faced strategic catastrophe. American B-29 operations had evolved beyond anything defensive planning had anticipated. The combination of high bomb capacity, long range, altitude capability when desired, and operational flexibility created a weapons system Japan could neither counter nor survive. Most critically, Asayeda noted, the Americans clearly possessed industrial capacity to sustain this level of attack indefinitely. Each B-29 raid represented enormous expenditure of aviation gasoline, bombs, spare parts, and aircrew training. Yet missions continued with increasing frequency and scale. Japanese intelligence compiled estimates of American B-29 production and deployment. By March 1945, approximately 1,000 superfortresses were operational in the Marianas across 5 bomb wings. Factory production continued at rates approaching 100 aircraft monthly. Pilot and crew training programs graduated sufficient personnel to man expanding formations. Most ominously, Americans had established logistics systems capable of delivering thousands of tons of bombs, millions of gallons of aviation fuel, and endless streams of spare parts across 7,000 miles of ocean to Mariana bases. This supply capability demonstrated industrial organization far beyond Japanese capacity. The strategic situation became clearer through spring 1945. American submarine blockade had strangled Japan's maritime commerce. Raw materials no longer reached factories. Food shipments to cities decreased monthly. Beginning in April, B-29 seconds commenced Operation Starvation, a naval mining campaign that closed remaining ports and waterways. Bombers dropped acoustic and magnetic mines in harbor approaches, shipping, channels, and inland waterways. These weapons, delivered from 1,500 feet altitude with precision made possible by sophisticated radar systems, sank vessels and rendered ports unusable. Combined with submarine operations, mining reduced Japan's merchant fleet to impotence. The comprehensive nature of American air attack evolved through early 1945. When weather permitted precision bombing, B-29 seconds conducted daylight raids against specific industrial targets from high altitude. Nakajima aircraft plants, Mitsubishi engine factories, oil refineries, and steel mills received attention from formations carrying high-explosive bombs. When weather obscured precision targets, firebombing raids devastated urban areas. When neither proved feasible, mining operations closed waterways. Every mission exploited the B-29's versatility. Capabilities Japanese planners had understood individually, but failed to appreciate in combination. The bomb load question that had seemed academic in 1944 now dominated Japanese strategic calculations. On paper, maximum internal capacity of 20,000 pounds appeared impressive, but constrained by fuel requirements for long-range missions. Japanese planners had estimated practical bomb loads of 6,000 to 8,000 pounds for raids from China, perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 from the Marianas with altitude sacrificed for payload. These estimates proved catastrophically low for firebombing missions. American commanders had discovered that by accepting reduced altitude, removing defensive armament, and optimizing fuel loads for specific missions, B-29 seconds could carry bomb loads approaching 16 to 18,000 pounds from the Marianas to Japanese cities. For shorter missions against targets in southern Japan or offshore islands, loads occasionally exceeded 20,000 pounds. The combination of massive payload capacity, precision navigation equipment, and sophisticated bombing radar meant that relatively small formations could deliver destruction previously, requiring hundreds of aircraft. A single B-29 carrying 16,000 pounds of incendiaries could devastate several city blocks. 100 B-29 seconds could obliterate an entire urban district. 300 B-29 seconds, the force dispatched against Tokyo on March 10th, could destroy a major portion of any Japanese city. American forces operated roughly 1,000 B-29 seconds from Mariana bases by mid-1945, with capacity for sustained operations limited only by ordnance production and crew fatigue rather than aircraft availability. Japanese technical officers who examined crashed or captured B-29 components documented findings that reinforced despair regarding defensive options. The bomb bay arrangement, 2 large chambers arranged fore and aft, allowed flexible ordnance loading. Bombs could be stacked vertically on shackles, maximizing use of available space. The intervalometer system that alternated bomb release between forward and aft bays maintained aircraft center of gravity during drops, eliminating the trim problems that plagued earlier bombers when releasing heavy loads. The bomb bay doors, when opened, created minimal drag compared to conventional designs, allowing high-speed bombing runs without performance penalties. Most significantly, the entire bomb loading and release system was designed for rapid turnaround. Ground crews could reload a B-29's bomb bays in under 2 hours, given sufficient ordnance availability. Maintenance between missions required 8 to 12 hours for routine inspections and minor repairs. An aircraft that bombed Tokyo one night could be prepared for another mission within 48 hours. Japanese bombers, by contrast, required extensive servicing between missions and lacked standardized procedures, enabling rapid operations tempo. The industrial implications became undeniable through examination of crashed B-29 wreckage. Every component showed evidence of mass production techniques. Structural members were formed using power presses and automated equipment rather than hand-fabricated by skilled workers. Riveting patterns were identical across different aircraft, suggesting automated or semi-automated assembly. Electrical wiring used standardized connectors and color-coding systems that simplified installation and maintenance. Hydraulic components were interchangeable between aircraft without fitting or adjustment. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most respected naval aviation officers, concluded in a June 1945 assessment that American aviation industry had achieved manufacturing capabilities fundamentally different from Japanese production. American factories produced aircraft as systematic products of industrial processes rather than as individual constructions by skilled craftsmen. This approach sacrificed some theoretical performance optimization, but gained enormous advantages in production volume, reliability, and maintainability. A B-29 might not represent the absolute peak of what aviation engineering could theoretically achieve, but 1,000 B-29 seconds performing reliably in sustained operations overwhelmed theoretical perfection that remained limited to small numbers. The strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo through summer 1945. By July, most major Japanese cities had been devastated by firebombing. Industrial production had collapsed to fractions of 1944 levels. Transportation infrastructure was shattered. Ports were closed by mining. Food distribution systems had failed, leaving urban populations on starvation rations. American air supremacy was absolute. Japanese fighter units, crippled by fuel shortages and pilot losses, rarely mounted effective resistance. Anti-aircraft ammunition stocks had dwindled until guns fell silent even when bombers appeared overhead. The final demonstration of B-29 capabilities came in August. 2 aircraft, extensively modified silverplate versions designated for nuclear weapons delivery, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. These missions represented the ultimate expression of what the B-29's design enabled. Flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, covering vast distances from Tinian to targets in Japan, delivering single weapons whose destructive power exceeded entire conventional raids. The Enola Gay carried one bomb weighing approximately 9,000 pounds to Hiroshima. That single weapon destroyed 4.5 square miles of the city center and killed an estimated 80,000 people immediately, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation effects over subsequent months. Boxcar's mission to Nagasaki 3 days later followed similar parameters. One aircraft, one bomb, one city devastated. The atomic bombings were possible only because B-29 possessed the combination of range, altitude capability, precision navigation equipment, and payload capacity to deliver weapons reliably over vast distances. Earlier bombers could not have carried the bulky atomic weapons. They lacked the range to reach targets from available bases. Their navigation equipment was insufficiently precise. The B-29 represented the culmination of American strategic bombing doctrine and industrial capability, delivering nuclear weapons that ended the war. For Japanese observers who had tracked B-29 operations since June 1944, the atomic bombings represented the logical endpoint of capabilities they had failed to adequately counter. The same aircraft that delivered thousands of tons of conventional incendiaries in March now delivered atomic weapons in August. The underlying capability was consistent: American industrial and technological superiority, expressed through sustained strategic bombing that Japan could neither prevent nor survive. The final B-29 missions against Japan flew on August 14, 1945, hours before Japan announced surrender. Over 300 superfortresses attacked targets near Tokyo, encountering no opposition. Japanese fighters remained grounded, conserving fuel for the expected American invasion that would never come. The B-29 crews returned to their Mariana bases without losses, completing the strategic bombing campaign that had devastated Japan's industrial capacity and broken civilian morale. Statistical analyses compiled after the war documented the B-29's impact. From November 1944 through August 1945, B-29 units flew over 33,000 sorties against Japanese targets. They delivered approximately 170,000 tons of bombs, roughly 60% incendiaries, and 40% high explosives. Mining operations dropped over 12,000 mines. Direct aircraft losses to enemy action totaled 414 B-29 seconds, a loss rate of approximately 1.2% per sortie. An additional 147 aircraft were lost to operational accidents, reflecting the demanding nature of sustained long-range operations. The campaign destroyed approximately 40% of the built-up areas in 66 Japanese cities. Over 2 million buildings were burned or demolished. Civilian casualties exceeded 600,000 dead, with millions more injured or displaced. Industrial production in mid-1945 was less than 20% of 1944 levels. Transportation systems were paralyzed. Food distribution had collapsed. The combination of strategic bombing, submarine blockade, and mining had reduced Japan to near starvation and industrial collapse. Japanese engineering officers and technical specialists who survived the war conducted extensive analyses of B-29 capabilities for American intelligence teams during occupation. Their assessments revealed sophisticated understanding of American technological and industrial advantages. The B-29 itself was an impressive aircraft, they acknowledged, but not fundamentally beyond Japanese engineering capabilities to design. What proved insurmountable was the industrial system that produced B-29 seconds in thousands rather than dozens, maintained them in sustained operations across vast distances, and supplied them with endless ordnance and fuel. The turbo superchargers enabling high-altitude operations required metallurgy and precision manufacturing Japan could not match at scale. The bomb bay design reflected systematic engineering approach to maximize payload within aerodynamic constraints. The defensive armament and fire control systems incorporated computing technology Japan had explored but never successfully deployed operationally. The pressurization system, allowing crew comfort at extreme altitude, required sealing techniques and materials Japanese industry had not perfected. Every aspect of the B-29 demonstrated American industrial sophistication that was not individual brilliance but systematic capability. Most critically, Japanese analysts recognized that American commanders had exploited the B-29's capabilities with flexibility Japanese military doctrine rarely permitted. When high-altitude precision bombing proved ineffective, Americans immediately shifted to low-altitude incendiary attacks. When fighter defenses were encountered, night operations became standard. When weather prevented visual bombing, radar systems enabled attacks through clouds. When strategic targets were destroyed, Americans transitioned to urban area bombing and mining operations. This operational adaptability, enabled by aircraft design that accommodated multiple mission profiles, proved as devastating as any single capability. The bomb load question that had dominated Japanese strategic calculations revealed itself as more complex than simple specifications suggested. Maximum capacity of 20,000 pounds was achievable under specific conditions. Practical loads varied, from 7,000 to 18,000 pounds, depending on mission parameters. But American industrial capacity meant that whatever load any individual B-29 carried, hundreds of identical aircraft would deliver similar payloads simultaneously. The cumulative effect was destruction on scales Japan could not survive. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, ended the strategic bombing campaign that had devastated the nation. The B-29 units in the Marianas stood down from combat operations, though aircraft continued flying reconnaissance and mercy missions, delivering food and medicine to prisoner-of-war camps. Crews who had lived with constant operational pressure for months experienced the strange quietness of peace. The silver bombers that had ruled Japanese skies fell silent. The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted comprehensive examinations of the B-29 campaign's effectiveness. Teams of analysts interviewed Japanese officials, examined industrial facilities, and reviewed captured documents. Their conclusions validated what operational results had suggested. Strategic bombing by B-29 seconds had been decisively effective in destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. While survey authors debated whether Japan would have surrendered without atomic bombs or planned invasion, they unanimously agreed that by August 1945, American air supremacy was complete and Japanese defenses were shattered. The survey noted specific factors that made the B-29 campaign uniquely effective. The combination of range, altitude capability, and payload allowed sustained operations from relatively secure bases. The Marianas, though occasionally threatened by Japanese attempts to mount desperate air raids, remained effectively invulnerable. 7,000 miles of ocean separated these bases from the American industrial heartland that supplied endless streams of bombs, fuel, spare parts, and replacement aircraft. This logistics system, invisible to Japanese defenders but fundamental to sustained operations, represented industrial organization that Japan could never match. Japanese fighter pilots interviewed after the war expressed consistent themes. They respected American engineering and recognized that no amount of individual skill could overcome technological and numerical disadvantages. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki, who survived the war with 3 B-29 kills, one of the highest tallies any Japanese pilot achieved, reflected that his successes came only under perfect circumstances. Surprise attacks from above with sun behind him, against isolated bombers separated from formations. Against formations flying at altitude with alert crews and functioning defensive systems, even the best Japanese pilots rarely succeeded. The 3 B-29 victories Sasaki achieved came at enormous cost in ammunition, fuel, and aircraft damage. Each engagement pushed his Kawasaki Ki-61 high-end fighter to performance limits, overheating engines and consuming fuel at rates that left minimal reserves for return to base. The kill-to-sortie ratio made such victories Pyrrhic. For every B-29 destroyed, dozens completed missions unmolested. American replacement capacity meant lost bombers were replaced within weeks. Japanese replacement capacity meant lost fighters often could not be replaced at all. The industrial chasm between American and Japanese production became undeniable through examination of maintenance records and supply systems. An American B-29 unit typically received sufficient spare parts to maintain operational readiness rates above 70%. Japanese fighter units operated on spare parts availability that frequently left more than half their nominal strength grounded for maintenance. American maintenance procedures used standardized, interchangeable components requiring minimal skilled labor. Japanese maintenance required extensive hand-fitting and adjustment of parts, demanding skilled technicians who were increasingly scarce as the war progressed. The B-29's technical advantages were real and significant, but post-war analyses emphasized that industrial capacity made those advantages decisive. Germany had developed jet fighters with performance exceeding any Allied propeller aircraft, but produced them in numbers too small to affect strategic outcomes. Japan had developed individual aircraft with impressive capabilities, but lacked the industrial base to produce them in quantities sufficient to challenge American numerical superiority. The B-29 campaign succeeded not because American aircraft were perfect, but because American industry produced them in overwhelming numbers while maintaining quality and reliability. The lessons Japanese engineers learned from the B-29 campaign influenced post-war Japanese industrial development profoundly. Emphasis on precision manufacturing, quality control, and systematic production processes that characterized American aviation industry became core principles in Japan's economic reconstruction. Former aviation engineers moved into civilian industries, bringing understanding of advanced manufacturing techniques. Companies like Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and Nakajima transitioned from military to civilian production, applying lessons learned from examining American equipment. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress flew its last combat missions in 1954 during the Korean War. By then, jet-powered bombers were replacing propeller-driven aircraft. The B-29's technological innovations, pressurized cabins, remote-controlled defensive armament, sophisticated bombing systems became standard features in subsequent generations of strategic bombers. But the B-29's legacy extended beyond specific technologies to fundamental lessons about industrial warfare. The story of B-29 operations against Japan ultimately demonstrates how industrial capacity and systematic production determine modern warfare outcomes. The specifications that seemed impressive on paper in 1940, maximum bomb load of 20,000 pounds, service ceiling above 30,000 feet, range exceeding 3,000 miles, became operationally decisive only when American industry produced superfortresses in thousands rather than dozens. Japanese planners who possessed accurate specifications but underestimated industrial implications paid the price in cities burned and industries destroyed. The bomb loads B-29 seconds actually delivered over Japanese targets varied with mission requirements. High-altitude precision raids from 30,000 feet might carry 7,000 to 8,000 pounds of high explosives optimized for fuel efficiency. Low-altitude firebombing missions carried 16,000 to 18,000 pounds of incendiaries by sacrificing altitude for payload. Short-range missions occasionally exceeded 20,000 pounds. The flexibility to optimize loads for specific missions, combined with industrial capacity to sustain any chosen operational tempo, created capability Japan could neither match nor survive. When B-29 seconds droned overhead at altitudes where turbo superchargers maintained engine power in thin air, they carried more than bombs. They carried proof that systematic industrial organization had become warfare's decisive factor. Individual aircraft performance mattered less than the industrial system producing hundreds of reliable aircraft monthly. Pilot skill remained important, but could not overcome numerical and technological disadvantages. Courage and determination, virtues Japanese military culture prized, proved insufficient against material superiority expressed through sustained strategic bombing. The B-29 demonstrated that 20th-century warfare was fundamentally industrial competition. The nation with greater production capacity, more sophisticated manufacturing, better logistics systems, and more systematic organization would prevail regardless of individual tactical victories. Japan never imagined the full implications of American industrial might until silver bombers filled the skies, operating beyond defensive reach, delivering destruction Japan could not prevent or endure. Today, only 2 B-29 seconds remain airworthy, preserved and maintained by dedicated organizations, ensuring future generations can witness these historic aircraft. When these bombers fly at air shows, there are 3,350 engines producing that distinctive deep-throated roar. Few spectators realize the technological complexity hidden within those engine nacelles. The turbo superchargers that enabled high-altitude operations, the sophisticated fuel systems that managed thousands of gallons across multiple tanks, the hydraulic systems controlling everything from landing gear to bomb bay doors, every component represented systematic engineering approach that defined American industrial capability. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan cost 600,000 Japanese civilian lives, displaced millions more, and destroyed the industrial infrastructure that sustained the war effort. Whether this destruction was militarily necessary or morally justifiable remains debated by historians. What is undeniable is that B-29 operations demonstrated industrial warfare's brutal mathematics. American industrial capacity, expressed through sustained strategic bombing, made Japanese defeat inevitable once Mariana bases became operational and sufficient bombers reached the theater. The Japanese never imagined that B-29 seconds would deliver not just bombs measured in thousands of pounds, but destruction measured in cities destroyed and industries obliterated. The aircraft specifications suggested impressive capabilities. The operational reality, enabled by American industrial might producing bombers and ordnance in overwhelming quantities, exceeded anything Japanese planning anticipated. By the time truth became undeniable through burning cities and shattered industries, Japan had lost the capacity to resist. The B-29 Superfortress proved that modern warfare belonged not to those with the bravest soldiers or most skilled pilots, but to those with the most advanced industrial systems. The silver bombers that ruled Japanese skies in 1945 were weapons in the most immediate sense, but they were also symbols of industrial organization that Japan could not match. Messages of systematic capability that made continued resistance futile, and proof that the age of industrial warfare had arrived with consequences no nation could ignore. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of March 13, 1943, a Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter touched down at Leeuwarden Air Base in occupied Holland, its pilot visibly shaken. Hauptmann Werner Streib, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced night fighter aces with over 40 confirmed kills, climbed down from his cockpit and immediately demanded an audience with his commanding officer. What he reported that morning would perplex German air defense intelligence for months to come. For nearly 4 hours, Streib had pursued a stream of RAF bombers through weather so foul that visual navigation should have been impossible. Cloud cover extended from 2,000 feet to 20,000 feet. No ground references were visible. No moonlight penetrated the dense overcast. Yet the British bombers had maintained precise formation, navigated with uncanny accuracy to their target at Essen, and returned along routes that suggested they possessed navigational capabilities the Germans could not explain. The bombers were flying blind through solid clouds, yet somehow they knew exactly where they were. German intelligence had spent years monitoring RAF operations, intercepting radio communications, analyzing crashed aircraft. They understood the British G system, had developed effective jamming. They knew about the H-2S ground mapping radar, having recovered intact units from downed Stirlings. They tracked the Oboe precision bombing system, though jamming it proved difficult. But something else was at work. The British navigators seemed to possess an additional method, something fundamental and reliable that worked regardless of cloud cover, regardless of German countermeasures, regardless of electronic warfare. The Germans were missing something obvious. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mystery deepened with each passing week of the 1943 bombing campaign. Luftwaffe signals intelligence units stationed across occupied Europe filed increasingly frustrated reports. British bomber streams regularly assembled over the North Sea with precision timing, aircraft from dozens of bases converging at predetermined coordinates in complete darkness and heavy weather. They maintained formation through cloud banks that German pilots considered unflyable. They executed turning points with accuracy that suggested real-time position knowledge, not mere dead reckoning. The bombers were navigating by something the Germans couldn't detect, couldn't jam, couldn't counter. What German intelligence failed to fully appreciate was that RAF Bomber Command had never abandoned the oldest form of navigation known to seafarers. While the Luftwaffe had invested heavily in radio navigation systems, dismissing celestial navigation as too slow and imprecise for modern warfare, the British had systematically trained thousands of navigators in techniques refined over centuries of maritime tradition. The Royal Air Force had adapted ancient practice to modern aerial warfare, creating capability that confounded an enemy who believed technology had superseded fundamental navigation methods. The story of this conceptual gap began not with German failure, but with British desperation. In 1937, when Air Chief Marshal Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt assumed command of RAF Bomber Command, he inherited a force utterly unprepared for night operations. His bombers could barely navigate in good weather. Navigation training was primitive. Crews relied on map reading and dead reckoning with minimal electronic aids. Ludlow Hewitt reported to the air staff that his command was unable to operate except in fair weather, a devastating admission for a force that might soon face war. The solution emerged from unexpected quarter. The RAF looked to maritime aviation, where flying boats had pioneered celestial navigation over featureless oceans. In November 1937, celestial navigation was formally endorsed as standard procedure for reconnaissance and bomber crews. This represented radical departure from the Luftwaffe's approach. While German bomber crews trained to follow radio beams with precision, British navigators learned to shoot stars with bubble sextants. The technical challenge was substantial. Traditional marine sextants required visible horizon for reference. Aircraft moving at 200 miles per hour through turbulent air lacked the stable platform ships provided. The solution came through adaptation of the bubble sextant, a device that used an internal bubble of air suspended in liquid to provide artificial horizon. The navigator would look through the sextant at a star, adjust the instrument until the star's reflected image aligned with the bubble, then record the altitude angle. With precise time, these measurements could be converted to position lines using sight reduction tables. By 1939, a specialized bubble sextant had been designed for RAF use. The Mark 9, manufactured by Hughes and Son, became standard equipment. Nearly every heavy bomber that entered service with Bomber Command featured an astrodome, a perspex hemisphere mounted in the fuselage roof that provided 360-degree view of the celestial sphere. Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, all carried astrodomes. Navigators spent hundreds of training hours mastering the complex mathematics of spherical trigonometry, learning to identify dozens of navigation stars, practicing sextant techniques until measurements could be taken quickly, even in turbulent conditions. The training program was remarkably thorough. Navigator trainees at schools across Britain and Canada were required to complete minimum of 450 celestial navigation shots before qualification. They learned to use the Air Almanac, memorized sight reduction tables, practiced plotting position, lines on specialized charts. The mathematical calculations were demanding. Taking a star sight, reading the tables, performing the arithmetic, plotting the result could take 5 minutes or more. In that time, an aircraft traveling at 200 knots covered roughly 16 nautical miles. Yet even with this limitation, celestial navigation provided accuracy far superior to pure dead reckoning, especially on long missions where small errors in wind calculation accumulated into catastrophic navigational failures. The Luftwaffe took fundamentally different approach. Following Germany's spectacular military victories in 1940, Hitler issued a decree that would handicap German aviation for the war's duration. No research project could receive priority funding unless it promised definitive military results within 2 years. This administrative decision, born from overconfidence in swift victory, killed long-term development programs, including advanced navigation research. The Luftwaffe committed entirely to radio navigation systems, Knickerbein, X-Gerät, Y-Gerät, sophisticated beam systems that guided bombers to targets with impressive precision when they worked. The German approach possessed undeniable advantages. Radio navigation required minimal training compared to celestial techniques. Bomber crews simply followed radio signals, adjusting course until they heard steady tone indicating proper alignment with invisible beam. The systems worked in any weather, through any cloud cover, providing continuous guidance from takeoff to bomb release. When British electronic warfare disrupted these systems during the Blitz, German bomber effectiveness collapsed precisely because crews lacked fallback navigation capability. They had been trained to rely exclusively on technology that could be jammed or spoofed. German aircrew training reflects this philosophy. Luftwaffe bomber and fighter pilots received minimal instruction in celestial navigation. The techniques were considered obsolete, too slow for modern air warfare's tempo. Why train crews in complex mathematical procedures when radio beams provided instant guidance? The Luftwaffe's emphasis on technical systems, rather than fundamental navigation skills, would prove serious vulnerability, though German commanders did not recognize this until much later in the war. RAF Bomber Command, by contrast, created layered navigation system. Electronic aids like G and oboe provided precision when available and within range. H-2S radar offered ground mapping through clouds. But underlying everything was celestial navigation, reliable backup that worked when electronics failed, when jamming degraded radio aids, when weather obscured all ground references. British navigators could fly missions using only sextant, watch, and almanac if necessary. Many did exactly that when electronic systems failed or when operating beyond G range. The practical execution of celestial navigation in combat bombers demanded remarkable skill under harrowing conditions. The navigator's station in a Lancaster or Halifax was cramped workspace behind the pilot, lit by dim red lights to preserve night vision. The navigator sat at small table covered with charts, surrounded by instruments, the G-box if installed, the H-2S display if equipped, computer for dead reckoning calculations, and always the sextant ready for use. When electronic aids were unavailable or untrusted, the navigator would inform the crew he needed to shoot stars. Gun turrets would cease rotation to provide stable platform. The navigator would climb to the Astrodome, a dangerous position during combat over Germany, where fighter attacks were constant threat. Standing in the dome, he was completely vulnerable, unable to defend himself, focused entirely on the sextant. He would identify the appropriate stars, carefully selected from pre-flight planning to provide optimal position-fixed geometry. Vega, Deneb, Polaris, Arcturus, whichever stars were visible and positioned to give good cuts when their position lines were plotted. The bubble sextant itself was precision optical instrument mounted on suspension system that dampened aircraft vibration. The navigator would bring the selected star into view through the sextant's telescope, carefully adjusting controls until the star's reflection in the instrument's mirror system aligned perfectly with the centered bubble. At the exact moment of alignment, he would note the time from his watch, synchronized to Greenwich Mean Time, and record the sextant's altitude reading. The entire process required 3 to 5 minutes per star. For adequate position fix, he needed observations of at least 2 stars, preferably 3 for redundancy and accuracy verification. Back at his navigation table, the real work began. Using the air almanac, he would look up each star's Greenwich hour angle and declination for the exact time of observation. These astronomical coordinates, combined with his sextant readings and assumed position, were fed into sight reduction tables, either the specialized aviation tables or the more comprehensive nautical tables used by the RAF. The calculations produced azimuth and intercept values for each star. These values translated into position lines on his chart. Where the position lines intersected was the aircraft's actual position. The mathematics demanded concentration under conditions that made focus nearly impossible. The bomber vibrated constantly from 4 Merlin engines. German flak burst around the aircraft, the concussions throwing the navigator against his table, scattering his papers and instruments. Night fighters prowled nearby, forcing violent evasive maneuvers while he tried to complete calculations. The temperature inside the bomber at 20,000 feet was well below freezing despite heated flight suits. Fingers went numb, making the delicate adjustments to sextant and dividers more difficult. Yet, the navigators persisted, performing these complex procedures under combat stress because accurate navigation meant survival, meant finding the target, meant getting the crew home. The Luftwaffe's failure to appreciate the effectiveness of this system stemmed partly from intelligence gaps and partly from systematic underestimation of traditional methods. German signals intelligence monitored RAF radio transmissions extensively, tracking G usage, noting when oboe-guided Pathfinder mosquitoes. They captured GI receivers from downed aircraft, analyzed the systems, developed jamming. They recovered intact H-2S units, studied the magnetron technology, began their own centimetric radar programs, but celestial navigation left no electronic signature to detect. It couldn't be jammed. It required no radio transmissions that Luftwaffe listening posts could intercept and triangulate. When German intelligence officers interrogated captured RAF navigators, they asked about electronic aids, about GI and oboe, and H-2S. They wanted to understand the technology they were fighting, but they seldom inquired deeply about the bubble sextants and air almanacs found in the wreckage, dismissing these as obsolete equipment, perhaps used for training but surely not operationally significant in modern air war. The Germans looked for technological sophistication and missed the elegant simplicity of navigation by celestial observation. This conceptual blindness had operational consequences. Luftwaffe tactical planning assumed that heavy weather and cloud cover would severely degrade RAF navigation accuracy, particularly when operating beyond G range. German air defense commanders believed that bomber streams would struggle to maintain formation and timing through solid overcast, that British accuracy would suffer without visual ground references. They planned defensive deployments based on these assumptions, but repeatedly, British bombers demonstrated capability to navigate precisely, through conditions that should have scattered them hopelessly. The night of March 5th into 6th, 1943, provided stark example. Bomber Command launched major raid against Essen, primary target in the industrial Ruhr. Weather was appalling. Cloud cover extended from 1,000 feet to 25,000 feet over the entire route. No moonlight, no ground references visible anywhere. G was being heavily jammed by German transmitters near the target. Under these conditions, German planners expected the raid to fail. The bombers scattered, unable to concentrate their attack. Instead, the raid achieved remarkable success. Pathfinder aircraft marked the target with precision. Main force bombers, guided by combination of oboe within its range, H-2S radar mapping, and celestial navigation where other aids failed, placed over 53,000 incendiary bombs and 900 tons of high explosives directly on the Krupp works. Reconnaissance photos showed devastating destruction in an area little more than 2 square miles. The Germans could not explain how the British had achieved such concentration through complete overcast. What the Luftwaffe intelligence analysts didn't fully appreciate was that while oboe had guided the initial pathfinders, the main force navigators had relied heavily on traditional celestial navigation, combined with dead reckoning to reach the target area, using the pathfinder markers for final aiming. The bombers had flown through 700 miles of solid cloud, maintaining stream formation and timing by crews who could shoot stars through the very thin breaks in clouds at altitude, or who had obtained fixes earlier and updated positions through careful dead reckoning until they reached the target zone. The technique was ancient, proven over centuries of maritime navigation, now applied to aerial warfare with deadly effectiveness. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistical evidence of RAF navigation accuracy grew increasingly impressive as 1943 progressed. Bomber Command had been largely ineffective in the war's early years. The Butt Report of August 1941, analyzing reconnaissance photos of bombing results, revealed that only about 1/3 of aircraft claiming to have attacked their targets had actually placed bombs within 5 miles of the aiming point. The revelation shocked British leadership and drove urgent improvements in navigation, training, and technology. By mid-1943, after intensive investment in navigator training, deployment of electronic aids, and systematic integration of celestial navigation into standard procedures, bomber accuracy had improved dramatically. Attacks on cities now regularly achieved concentration sufficient to overwhelm fire services and cause genuine damage to German industrial capacity. The improvement stemmed from multiple factors: the deployment of Pathfinder Force with its specialized marking techniques, introduction of H-2S radar, expanded G and oboe coverage. But underlying all these advances was Navigator Corps, trained to professional maritime standards in celestial navigation, providing reliable foundation when technology failed or was unavailable. The German response to improving RAF navigation took several forms, none entirely successful. Luftwaffe Signals Intelligence devoted enormous resources to monitoring British electronic navigation systems. They developed increasingly sophisticated jamming for GI, rendering it largely ineffective over Germany by late 1942, though it remained valuable for navigation over Britain and the North Sea. They attempted to jam oboe with less success, the system's microwave frequencies and precision timing making effective jamming difficult. They captured and analyzed every piece of British electronics equipment they could recover from crashed aircraft. But they never developed comprehensive counter to celestial navigation because they never fully recognized its continued operational significance. The Luftwaffe assumed that modern air warfare had moved beyond such primitive methods. They saw astrodomes as anachronistic features, bubble sextants as training equipment. They could not conceive that the RAF had successfully integrated 18th-century navigation techniques with 20th-century electronic systems to create robust capability immune to electronic warfare. The irony runs deeper. Germany possessed excellent celestial navigation tradition in its maritime forces. Kriegsmarine navigators were trained to the same professional standards as their Royal Navy counterparts. German U-boats used celestial navigation routinely for ocean passages, their navigators skilled with sextants and sight reduction. But this expertise never transferred to Luftwaffe doctrine. The two services operated in separate spheres, with minimal cross-pollination of techniques. The Air Force committed to technological solutions, while the Navy maintained traditional skills. Some individual Luftwaffe units did employ celestial navigation, particularly long-range reconnaissance aircraft and maritime patrol units operating far over Atlantic or Mediterranean. These crews recognized the value of backup navigation when beyond radio aid coverage. But the practice never became standard throughout the bomber and fighter forces. Most Luftwaffe aircrew lacked training in celestial techniques, leaving them dependent on radio navigation even when operating in regions where such aids were unavailable or unreliable. This dependency created vulnerability that Allied intelligence exploited. British electronic warfare became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. German radio navigation systems that had proven so effective during the Blitz of 1940 through 41 were progressively degraded by jamming, meconing, which was false beacon transmission, and other deception techniques. Luftwaffe bomber accuracy declined correspondingly. Without fallback navigation capability, German crews struggled to find targets when their radio systems were corrupted. The contrast with RAF operations, where electronic aids augmented but did not replace fundamental navigation skills, was stark. By late 1943, the strategic implications had become clear. RAF Bomber Command could operate in virtually any weather, day or night, with navigation accuracy sufficient for effective bombing. The introduction of radar bombing through complete overcast, combined with reliable navigation by celestial and electronic means, meant that British bombers were no longer weather-dependent. They could maintain pressure on German industry regardless of cloud cover, regardless of moonlight, regardless of German electronic countermeasures. The Luftwaffe's defensive planning, predicated on assumptions that weather would frequently ground or scatter British bombers, proved incorrect. The human dimension of this technological and doctrinal divide deserves emphasis. RAF navigators underwent rigorous training that produced genuine professionals. Navigation courses lasted months, demanded mathematical aptitude and attention to detail that weeded out many candidates. Those who qualified wore distinctive navigator wings with pride, understanding they were masters of complex craft essential to mission success. Their workload during operations was enormous. They constantly updated positions, calculated winds from drift measurements, monitored electronic aids, took celestial sights when opportunity allowed, advised pilots on courses to steer, logged every detail meticulously. In contrast, Luftwaffe bomber crews that survived early war operations found themselves increasingly relegated to defensive roles as the strategic initiative passed to the Allies. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's offensive capability had eroded severely. What bomber forces remained were committed to tactical support of ground operations or desperate attempts to interdict Allied logistics. Long-range strategic bombing, which required sophisticated navigation over extended distances, had largely ceased. The radio navigation infrastructure the Germans had relied upon was destroyed or overrun as Allied armies advanced. Luftwaffe crews found themselves operating without the technological crutches on which their training had depended, and lacked the fundamental navigation skills to compensate. The final phase of the European Air War demonstrated the strategic value of RAF's multi-layered navigation approach. As Allied armies advanced across France and into Germany following D-Day in June 1944, Bomber Command extended operations deeper into the Reich. Targets in eastern Germany, in Silesia, in what is now Poland and Czech Republic, lay far beyond range of British-based GE transmitters. Oboe coverage was similarly limited. H-2S provided radar mapping but required operator skill and offered limited precision. Celestial navigation became increasingly critical for these maximum range missions. Navigators shooting stars over the North Sea obtained accurate fixes before crossing the enemy coast. They updated positions periodically during the long flight across Germany, timing observations for moments when the bomber stream was relatively safe from fighter attack. The final approach to target might rely on H-2S or pathfinder markers, but the navigation to the target area depended fundamentally on celestial techniques combined with careful dead reckoning. The bombers reached targets that German defences assumed were beyond effective British operational range. One particularly revealing incident occurred in February 1944 during a raid on Leipzig, a target deep in eastern Germany. Weather over the entire route was solid, overcast with tops, above 25,000 feet. G was jammed beyond usability as soon as the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast. H-2S provided limited utility in the featureless agricultural landscape of central Germany. Yet the bomber stream navigated over 700 miles, maintained formation timing, and placed concentrated attack on the target with accuracy that stunned German intelligence analysts reviewing the damage. Post-mission debriefs revealed the technique. Navigators had obtained excellent celestial fixes over the North Sea before crossing the coast. They had carefully calculated wind velocities from drift measurements and G readings while still within range of usable signals. Using these winds and periodic star shots through thin patches in the cloud deck at altitude, they had dead reckoned across Germany with cumulative error of less than 5 miles over the entire route. Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with oboe-like systems that could reach to Leipzig's range, had marked the target. The main force had arrived at precisely the correct time and location, despite weather that should have made such precision impossible. German signals intelligence recorded the raid in detail. Luftwaffe controllers tracked the bomber stream by radar, noting its unwavering course, its precise timing, its apparent immunity to the weather conditions that would have scattered German formations. The after-action analysis concluded that the British must have deployed new electronic navigation system, perhaps extended-range variant of GE or some other radio aid. The possibility that RAF navigators were successfully employing celestial navigation through 700 miles of clouds simply did not occur to the analysts. It seemed too primitive, too unreliable for modern warfare. The belief persisted even when evidence suggested otherwise. Crashed RAF bombers regularly yielded bubble sextants, air almanacs, and sight reduction tables. German technical intelligence photographed and catalogued these items, but they were filed as auxiliary equipment, perhaps useful for training flights or overwater navigation where electronic aids were unavailable. The idea that RAF crews relied on these instruments as primary navigation tools for missions over Germany contradicted German understanding of modern air operations. The cognitive disconnect was complete. Some German officers did recognize the value of traditional navigation skills. General Lieutenant Josef Kammhuber, architect of the German night fighter defense system, understood that technology alone was insufficient. He advocated for improved navigator training in the Luftwaffe, including instruction in celestial techniques. But by 1943 and 44, German training programs were being compressed to rush pilots and crews to operational units as quickly as possible. There was neither time nor resources for extensive navigation instruction. The Luftwaffe's training infrastructure was itself under attack from Allied bombers. Fuel shortages restricted training flights. The systematic, thorough instruction that had characterized pre-war Luftwaffe training became impossible to maintain. The contrast with RAF training grew more pronounced as the war continued. Even in 1944 and 45, with Britain under V-weapon bombardment and the war's outcome no longer in doubt, Bomber Command maintained rigorous navigator training standards. Courses at navigation schools in Canada, South Africa, and Britain continued to require hundreds of celestial observations, extensive dead reckoning practice, thorough grounding in mathematical techniques. The investment in navigator training never wavered because Bomber Command leadership understood that navigation was the foundation upon which all other operational capabilities rested. Without accurate navigation, the most sophisticated bombing equipment was useless. The crews would never reach their targets. This institutional commitment to fundamental skills, combined with deployment of advanced electronic aids, gave RAF Bomber Command capability that German defenses could never fully counter. The bombers could operate in any weather. They could navigate when electronic aids were jammed. They possessed redundant navigation methods that made them resilient to German countermeasures. This operational flexibility, achieved through integration of ancient and modern techniques, proved decisive in the strategic bombing campaign. The final statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1943 and 1945, RAF Bomber Command flew over 300,000 operational sorties against targets across occupied Europe and Germany. They dropped over 900,000 tons of bombs with increasing accuracy as the war progressed. By 1945, using techniques refined through 3 years of combat, including sophisticated integration of celestial navigation with electronic aids and radar systems, Bomber Command achieved bombing accuracy that would have seemed impossible in 1941. Precision attacks on synthetic oil plants, transportation networks, and industrial targets contributed significantly to the collapse of German war production. The human cost was staggering. Bomber Command suffered over 55,000 killed, a 44% fatality rate among aircrew, but those who survived knew they had been part of a campaign that had employed every possible means, technical and traditional, to achieve its objectives. The navigators particularly understood that their mastery of ancient maritime techniques applied to aerial warfare had been as important as any electronic system. The stars that had guided seafarers for millennia had also guided British bombers through the night skies over Germany. German recognition of this reality came late and incompletely. By 1945, with the Reich collapsing and Luftwaffe operations reduced to desperate improvisation, some German aviation officers began appreciating what RAF had achieved. In prisoner interrogations and post-war analysis, they expressed grudging admiration for British navigator training. They recognized that the RAF's investment in fundamental navigation skills, combined with technological advancement, had created a force that could operate effectively regardless of conditions. The lesson came too late to affect German operations, but it informed post-war aviation doctrine in multiple nations. The story extends beyond World War II. Modern aviation has seen pendulum swing between technology and fundamental skills multiple times. The advent of inertial navigation systems in the 1950s and 60s seemed to make celestial navigation obsolete. Why train navigators in complex mathematical procedures when accelerometers and gyroscopes could track position automatically? Yet inertial systems had failure modes. They drifted over time. They required external updates. Through the 1970s and into the 80s, Military aviation retained celestial navigation capability as backup. The periscopic sextant, a refined descendant of the World War II bubble sextant, remained standard equipment on long-range bombers, like the B-52. GPS navigation appeared to finally solve the problem definitively. Satellite navigation provided accuracy that made all previous systems obsolete. Celestial navigation training was eliminated from most military aviation programs in the 1990s. The ancient art seemed finally and permanently superseded by technology, yet vulnerabilities remained. GPS signals could be jammed or spoofed. Solar activity could disrupt satellite communications. The possibility of adversaries developing anti-satellite weapons made over-reliance on space-based navigation concerning to military planners. In a development that would have amused RAF navigators of the 1940s, the United States Navy announced in 2015 the reinstatement of celestial navigation training at the Naval Academy. The recognition that fundamental navigation skills provided resilience that pure technology could not match had come full circle. Modern officers would learn the same techniques that had guided bombers through clouds over Germany 7 decades earlier. The sextant, whether handheld or periscopic, whether used aboard ships or aircraft, remained relevant precisely because it was immune to electronic warfare, independent of infrastructure, limited only by visibility of celestial bodies. The Luftwaffe's failure to maintain parallel capability during World War II thus stands as cautionary tale about over-reliance on technology. German aviation achieved remarkable technical sophistication in many areas. Their radio navigation systems were genuinely innovative. Their radar development, though ultimately outpaced by Allied advances, produced capable equipment. But they had neglected the foundation skills, the navigational techniques that had proven value across centuries. When their technological systems were countered or became unavailable, they lacked fallback capabilities. They had built impressive structure on inadequate foundation. The British approach, maintaining traditional skills while embracing new technology, proved more resilient. RAF navigators could use GI when available, employ H2S when conditions permitted, rely on oboe within its range. But they could also shoot stars through breaks in clouds, dead reckon with professional competence, and navigate by the oldest methods known to travellers when everything else failed. This redundancy, this layered approach to navigation, gave Bomber Command operational capability that could not be entirely degraded by any single German countermeasure. The psychological impact on German defenders was subtle but significant. Luftwaffe night fighter pilots and ground controllers, confronting bomber streams that maintained formation and timing through conditions that should have caused chaos, began to believe British capabilities were almost supernatural. The reality was more prosaic but equally effective. British navigators were simply very well-trained professionals using all available tools, modern and traditional, to accomplish their mission. The mystique arose not from advanced technology but from thorough training in fundamental skills. In post-war analyses, German aviation officers acknowledged this advantage. They recognized that the Luftwaffe's training system, despite producing many individually skilled pilots, had failed to develop navigator specialists with the broad skill set RAF had cultivated. German crews could follow radio beams with precision. They could operate sophisticated equipment competently. But they lacked the deep foundation in traditional navigation that would have made them resilient when technology failed or was unavailable. The institutional knowledge that navies had accumulated over centuries had been maintained by RAF, but neglected by Luftwaffe, and that neglect had operational consequences. The broader lesson transcends aviation. Military organizations face perpetual tension between investing in new technology and maintaining fundamental skills. Technology offers apparent shortcuts, ways to achieve results without the lengthy training traditional methods require. Radio navigation meant German bomber crews could be deployed with minimal navigation instruction. Why spend months teaching complex mathematics and celestial observation when crews could simply follow radio signals? The efficiency seemed compelling, but efficiency that eliminates redundancy creates vulnerability. When the shortcuts fail, when the technology is countered, when the infrastructure is destroyed, what remains? Organizations that maintain fundamental skills alongside technological capability possess resilience that pure technology cannot match. The RAF understood this instinctively, maintaining rigorous navigator training even as electronic aids proliferated. The Luftwaffe optimized for immediate efficiency, neglecting foundation skills, and paid the price when their technological systems proved vulnerable to countermeasures. The story of celestial navigation in World War II bomber operations thus becomes story about institutional philosophy, about choices in training and doctrine that had strategic consequences. It demonstrates that successful military organizations must balance innovation with preservation of proven techniques, must embrace new technology while maintaining mastery of fundamental skills. The bomber navigators of 1943 through 1945, British and German alike, lived the consequences of choices their air forces had made years earlier about what skills were worth maintaining and what training was worth the investment. For the British navigators, standing in their astrodomes over blacked-out Germany, shooting stars through breaks in the clouds while flak burst around them and fighters prowled nearby, the ancient techniques were lifelines. The same mathematics that had guided Cook across the Pacific, that had taken Nelson to Trafalgar, that had enabled centuries of maritime exploration, now guided Lancasters and Halifaxes to targets deep in the Third Reich. The stars remained constant reference, immune to jamming, independent of human infrastructure, available to any navigator with sextant and skill to use it. The Luftwaffe, having dismissed these techniques as obsolete, found themselves fighting enemy who possessed capability they could not match because they could not even fully recognize it. They looked for sophisticated electronic systems and missed the elegant simplicity of navigation by celestial observation. They intercepted British radio transmissions and never heard the silence of stellar navigation. They captured British equipment and catalogued the sextants without understanding their operational significance. The cognitive gap was complete. The consequences were strategic. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.